welcome to another episode of Two Who's Review. I'm Alex,
I'm Fitz.
and today we're checking out School Reunion, the third episode of the second series, and the return of Sarah Jane Smith to the show.
Goody.
Am I right in thinking that this is the first time that a companion has returned without their doctor also returning?
Um, yeah. Yep, that sounds about right. I can't think of... Because any other time that's happened, it's been, the blank doctors, so,
Yeah,
the doctors have always been in tow. And
that's what I
even,
thought, yeah.
and even technically when in the Five Doctors, even though Tom Baker technically wasn't there and they just used recycled scenes from Sharda, those scenes had Romana in them, so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Um, it's also it's a nice way of sort of I guess really firmly establishing that the classic series is still canon, because I don't think that had
Hmm.
been quite uh, confirmed at that point. Like, sure, like they had, obviously the Daleks had been introduced and there was a history there, but I don't think he really mentioned them besides the Time War in the first
He
series.
he did mention Davros to Van Statten, but that I think is about it.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, he just said like a creator. He
Yeah,
didn't
no, he said
specifically
by a
name drop.
genius Van Statten, a man who was king of his own little world, you'd like him.
Okay, yeah, but he didn't name drop Davros. I didn't think
No,
so.
no, 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 no.
Yeah, but like this is like hard and fast. Like for 2006, uh, it's nice to have that confirmation. Looking back, it's
Hmm.
pretty obvious. But
Hmm.
like I don't know if they had firmly established it before this point. If it was a firm sequel or just a reboot.
Yeah.
Um,
It's only
yeah,
like a season 2 risk. Like they wouldn't have done it in season 1.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, it's an interesting episode. It does a lot really well.
Hmm.
It's another one of those ones that I think tends to get passed up quite a bit in favor of the powerhouse Tenant episodes.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it it's about as good as I remember it being. Like
Yeah,
again, it's not, as you say, it's not one of the powerhouse episodes for Tenant, but it's certainly not a bad or even mediocre
no,
episode as far as I'm concerned.
yeah.
Hmm.
It. I mean, it sort of goes to show how good the show like is gonna get under Russell T Davies, because this is like
Hmm.
a really solid episode, but it
Hmm.
really it's the fact that it does get overlooked in favor of stuff that is rightfully more interesting and better to look at
Hmm.
is just it's a testament to how much the quality of the show is going to just consistently improve while Russell T Davies is at the helm.
Yeah, yeah. It's clear there's a. I mean, it may not be explicitly explored here, but there's hints at I think a bigger plan and a broader vision um,
Yeah,
that you get, which is always very satisfying.
indeed. Jumping over to the timescales, this has an
Hmm.
average rating of 7.9 out of 227 votes. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty close to where I'd put it as well.
I think I might put it maybe slightly lower, but that's mainly because again maybe I am just comparing it to other Powerhouse Tenant episodes, and I think well um how great is this, but that I could be wrong there, so.
I mean, put it this way: we both gave Tooth and Claw an 8, and I think that episode and this episode are pretty much like level in my mind with their quality. I don't know which one is my favorite. Uh,
I prefer Tooth and Claw myself.
okay, well maybe that'll become a bit more evident in my mind
Mm,
over this discussion.
sure, sure.
Um, Jumping over quickly to the comparisons of other David Tennant episodes,
Mm.
this sits at oh around roughly like the 15th or so best.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's in the top half certainly, whereas with Tooth and Claw it was like sitting comfortably in the middle.
Mm.
So I think it's clear that like the fan base, or at least the users of the timescales as a whole, seem to prefer this one to Tooth and Claw. There could be a
Mm.
number of reasons for that. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but
Mm.
that's just where they put it.
Mm-hmm.
It has a 7.7 for plot, which I think is, pretty fair because like the episode, it's largely a character study for
Yeah, yeah,
the Doctor and companions. The
yeah.
plot is a serviceable. It's serviceable for getting the characters to those points,
Yeah.
and there are some. I know that there are some people who have big issues with certain plot beats that do
Mm.
arise. So I
Mm-hmm.
think I can understand why seven point
Mm.
seven is where the plot has
Mm.
landed on this website.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it like you're right to point out the characterization part. That's obviously a big element in the story. I'm pretty happy to say neither the story element or the character element, they don't really, I think, get in the way of each other too much.
Yeah,
They support each other pretty well. I mean, in terms of like the story and like the alien invasion, it's fairly standard for Doctor Who. It's like, oh, evil species, invading the planet. What are we gonna do, Doctor? Solving a mystery. Um, there are certain elements of the plot that I like the fact that the Doctor's just sort of integrated into this teacher role. Um, all of that is taken care of pretty quickly. It's like, oh yeah, Mickey's found us this basically a mission to do and something to sort out. So I actually kind of like the fact that they, you know, cut out all the
the call to action.
extemporaneous stuff. Yeah, so um, that's pretty good. But yeah, like there's nothing as we've said. I am just comparing it to the really great Tennant episodes, but there's nothing super crazy or intricate happening with the plot, but it doesn't really have to be.
Yeah.
It is what it is, and it does what it does decently enough in my view. So yeah, I can understand why people
Mm-hmm.
would rate that for the plot.
8.7 for acting. I think besides some child actors, which is to be expected,
Mm,
that's about fair. Everyone's really good in this. Anthony
yeah,
Head is great. Elizabeth Sladen picks up from the 80s right where she left off.
yeah,
Uh, all the other main characters, they get their moments to shine.
mm,
It's a really solid episode for acting overall.
yeah. And even I don't know who it is, whether it's the original voice actor, but the guy for K9 just
Yeah, it's the same guy, John Leeson.
yeah, nice. Yeah, he's bringing back all the old charm to that role, which is really good to
Mm,
see.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, did Anthony Head is he the main Quiltane
Yeah,
villain
he's
dude?
he's Brother Lasser or Mr. Finch or whatever
Yes.
you want to call him. He's the main villain.
Yeah, he's quite good. It's one of those classic scenarios where the performance gets to very sort of melodramatic, almost histrionic levels, but that's expected for Doctor Who. That's the point, and he really sells it. Like in the beginning, when he's sort of just trotting down the hallway and he's humming to himself, there's a wonderful, almost like a Bond villain quality to him, which is always good fun, and he portrays it with a good deal of conviction and enough so that it really sells his character, which is really good.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few other Anthony Head roles. He's fantastic in basically anything he does. I know him
Hmm.
mainly from Merlin,
Mm,
when he played King Uther,
mm,
and he's great there as well. But he gets to like sort of go a bit more big with it.
hmm.
But he also brings like a dignity to the
Oh yeah.
role. Um, and I think like it's really similar to uh, some other Doctor Who villains we've had in the past that have been portrayed by you know uh, really competent actors. I'm
Oh
trying to
shoot, I
remember.
sorry, I just realized I can't believe I didn't make the connection before. He's Giles in Buffy.
Yeah, exactly. That's him as well.
That
Um,
okay, that makes sense.
yeah, it does. But like I equate it almost to God. I don't know. I guess Simon Pegg is the closest approximation I can think of at the moment, where he's allowed to be a bit you know eccentric and I'm going to say at times weird with it,
Hmm.
but he sort of he commits so wholeheartedly to it
Oh
that you
yeah.
don't for a second think, okay, well he's just
No.
jamming it up. Like whenever
No.
he's doing the big screams, like that could easily come across as really
Oh
hokey, but he just
yeah.
manages to pull it off so
Yeah.
well.
It's a I think a tricky thing when you're playing very sort of melodramatic villainous roles that it's really important that the actor portraying them they fully commit, because if
Yeah.
they don't believe it, the audience won't
Hmm.
either. It's yeah, that element is very important, and it is great to see that he takes it seriously, because it's I'm sure I've mentioned something similar with Doctor Who overall. I think a lot of people, if they're not fans of the show, if they're on the outside looking in, I think it's easy to write the show off as just sort of, low budget and over the top and weird, and to not take it seriously. But the fact that he, clearly is treating this role and the show with a good amount of respect, really helps to sell that performance in the end.
Yeah, indeed.
Hmm.
7.3 for effects. Yeah, it's a similar thing with the
Yeah.
werewolf last time. The Krillitanes don't look great. We're kind of entering the show's kind of getting into its like sort of cocky teen years at the moment, where it's like, okay, we did season one, and we've got a fan base. We can afford to get a bit ambitious. Let's write in some insane creatures that will have to force some
Mm.
underpaid computer graphics workers to try and bring to life. Let's do a werewolf. Let's do 13 bats. In the future, we're gonna do the devil himself in CGI.
And the
They haven't
Lazarus
quite
monster
the yeah,
for later
exactly. They
on.
haven't. Well, yeah, that as well. Like they haven't quite got the mix
No.
of CGI and practical elements, and also we're also still in that phase of computer graphics where they were getting to the point where, and I've mentioned it before, around the mid 2000s, early 2010s, there was an era where computer graphics was getting to be really detailed and well, I'm going to say competent for now, but the problem is that the technology very quickly got a lot better, and as it did,
Mm.
the stuff that they were doing got it aged significantly worse than it otherwise would have. So, like in
Yeah.
the past, when they didn't have the technological ability to do stuff like this, they would have used a mix of practical elements and then used a bit of CGI here and there, and that stuff tends to hold up a lot more than a lot of this
Mm.
stuff.
Mm. Yeah. When they, I mean, even when you're using like a mix of the practical and the CGI, you're always taking a risk. And I've mentioned before, they kind of, with the Slitheen, for example, they've gone the, the Walking with Dinosaurs route, where they're using both a mix of practical and CG. But yes, you're taking, I think, even more of a risk where you're just having it all CG, because, as you say, that technology has just evolved so quickly. Um,
Mm.
in the intervening years, that it's hard not to look back and think, okay, well, it's Doctor Who, that's expected, but yeah, it's not particularly convincing CGI. It doesn't bother me too much, because similarly with the werewolf, a lot of scenes you won't see them, like obviously also for censorship constraints. A lot of times people are getting slaughtered, you don't see it, and that works to its benefit. But like, yeah, when they're on screen, you can tell that yeah, these aren't um, terribly convincing.
Yeah, I think when they're in motion, they're fine because there's a lot of uh, movement and action to sort of hide the effect. It's only really
Mm,
when the camera lingers on them
yeah,
that it really stands out.
yeah. When they're in the hallway right before the fire alarm gets tripped, I mean, they could have done worse with it and how they directed, but yeah, like they're the most noticeable moments, to be
There's
sure.
certainly a reason that they chose to right before the final encounter go back into their human forms because I think
Mm,
even they knew,
yeah.
look, this is going to be tough. Let's just be human as much as we possibly can. We've
Mm,
had our big scare scene. Now
mm,
let's just cut. We've got a budget to consider here.
mm, yeah. That's entirely true.
8.2 for replay value. Yeah, I think is really good on a rewatch. I don't know if it gets better or worse. Like I said, it's about as good as I remember it. But I think also
Same.
it
Yeah.
has a nice sort of arc surrounding. because a lot of this season is like a lot of this episode rather is introducing new viewers to the idea of a companion isn't forever,
Mm.
and a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with that if they were just joining from 2005. They would go, Rose Tyler's our first companion,
Mm.
and I'm familiar with how TV shows work. A main cast lasts ages. No, no, that's not how.
No.
Even having seen a regeneration of a Doctor, you have to introduce an audience to the idea that the show will continue, but the main cast will constantly be changing, and
Yep.
bringing an old school companion into the mix, as well as having the Doctor lay out the curse of his long life. It's
Mm.
a really nice way of approaching that. We're sort of getting into themes already, and that's one of the main ones of the episode. But that's something that really contributes to the replayability of the episode, especially when you know Rose's outcome at the end of this season.
Mm. Yeah. I think yeah, that quality with the characterization is a big strength here. And as you say, like they haven't that element of the Doctor, going on, but the companions not that hasn't really been introduced yet. So and having like Sarah Jane, one of the most well-known companions coming back to sort of teach that lesson, um, sort of really brings it home, which is really
Yeah.
good. Mm.
And 17 out of 98 people say that this story requires a previous. I don't know if it requires a previous in the sense that like this episode is crucial to watch before going into school reunion, but it a cursory knowledge of some of the previous characters does help considerably.
Mm.
I would not want to put this on as a person's first episode of the show.
Yeah. I mean, like as an episode, apart from the Sarah Jane stuff, you could theoretically do that. It's again a fairly stock standard story, but the whole hook is Sarah Jane being there, I think, and you probably would struggle a little bit to really establish these characters and understand why her presence is as important as it is. Um, and certainly, as you say, for like a first time viewing, like it's not the worst thing you could show a first time Who fan, but yeah, not the best either.
Yeah. Um, okay, yeah, so let's do a bit more of an in-depth analysis now that we've taken
Mm-hmm.
care of the timescales. So we've mentioned the uh, how bringing back Sarah Jane is something that highlights the nature of the show and its change and the fact that companions come and go.
Mm.
It obviously factors into something we've been talking about with David Tennant, which is his loneliness, and here
Mm.
it's incredibly overt, more so than it has been in past episodes when he actually speaks to Rose about him having to live on after his companions have left him.
Mm.
Like that's the first time that element of this Doctor has really come to the surface, as opposed
Mm.
to just being something that subtly we pick up on now that we know where this Doctor goes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think yeah, as you say, it's a big theme, and because as you've said, it does get explored even more as the series goes on with Tennant. Like that's a big thing with him. So it's I don't know if you could say this is the establishing episode for that, but it's certainly helping with constructing that characterization. Um, yeah. So even from that standpoint, including Sarah Jane in the way that she is, really enhances the story, I think.
Yeah, and it's nice to see her. It's nice to see Sarah Jane taking an active investigation role post
Yeah.
TARDIS. It's
Yeah.
rare that we get to follow up on what a companion is doing
Mm.
after leaving the show, and it's nice to see that she hasn't lost that investigative edge that
Yeah,
she's had.
which is great because I think I even mentioned before, as much as I love the Tom Baker era, certainly in that first season of his, unfortunately, Sarah Jane, she lost some of her edge, which is really annoying. Even some of the stuff we've seen, she's not taking the active role that she's taken even in some John Pertwee stories.
Yeah, her
Um,
best episode that we've watched so far is Invasion of the Dinosaurs.
yeah, Yeah, that's true. I mean, she has a little bit of the edge with in Tom Baker's first story, Robot, but it gets dropped pretty quickly after that, which is again really frustrating. But it's good that RTD has picked up on that and decided to bring it back. Um, it really it allows her to sort of stand on her own 2 feet. It allows her to define her own character. And as you say, it's good to see what she was doing in the intervening time. It's good to see that she it's kind of like what you've said before. What the Doctor leaves behind. Well, in this case, it's actually a really really good thing because she's been able to maintain that curiosity and she's still being a journalist. So yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, and that's look, I'm gonna talk about Rose. I'm gonna talk about Rose. I didn't think I'd be doing it this early, but it's something that I need to address when talking about this episode. Um, so the stuff with Sarah Jane, and the connections she's had to the
Mm,
classic era, that's really the bulk of her role in this story. That and to bring K9 into the mix.
mm,
Um, you know, uh, it's also to be a rival to Rose.
mm,
And look, I'll be the first to admit, I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and say this is the first episode of Revival Who in a long time that you won't hear me say Rose gets captured or trapped, because she doesn't.
mm.
Congratulations, Rose. For the first time since your introduction, you've gone an entire episode without being captured or trapped somewhere. It's literally taken you 16 episodes to not get captured or trapped.
Mm.
That's got to be a record. I would be hard pressed to believe there's a companion who has that kind of damsel spree.
Mm.
Um, Unfortunately, though, it's still not a really good Rose episode because, like, if you remove her from the narrative, it still plays out the exact same way. She does nothing to help further the plot or resolve
Mm.
the rising action. She doesn't really do anything.
Mm.
Her role in the story is to get a glimpse of what happens after the Doctor. It's to come to grips with,
Mm.
I wasn't the first and I won't be the last. You know, but and as Sarah Jane says in the end, some things are worth getting your heart broken for.
Mm.
That's her arc in the episode,
Mm.
which is a good one. I just wish that she wasn't such a cow for the rest of the episode, because for a bulk of the middle of the episode, her only role is to be a brat to Sarah Jane. And look, I'll admit, Sarah Jane also gives some back to Rose. They're I was about to say equally bratty, but they're not, because there's a moment where Sarah Jane starts to uh, extend the olive branch and try to make amends, and Rose is still really rude to her. But the reason I'm more uh, harsh with Rose about this kind of behavior is, like I said, and I've been saying constantly, the companion is the audience's eyes. And especially for those who aren't familiar with the classic series, if Rose is your stand-in and she's treating beloved companion Sarah Jane with such animosity, what are you expecting your audience to do? You know? If
Mm.
Rose is treating Sarah Jane as competition for the Doctor, then it doesn't matter how the Doctor treats her. The audience are going to see her that way. And it fortunately doesn't fall into this trap, but it was really really close to making, at least in my opinion, it could have come really close to making a new Who audience hate Sarah Jane and not want to see any more of her. Now that didn't happen. We got the Sarah Jane spin-off. We got more appearances from her in the show. Um, but I know it's a really fine line, and you got to be careful, and especially because it's her only role in the story. I can't stress enough. She does nothing else in this episode. And again, I probably wouldn't be so harsh if there wasn't that scene in the classroom, what right before they have their little competition about who's seen the weirdest shit. That's when Sarah Jane is extending the olive branch. That's when she's trying to make amends, and Rose is having none of it. She's shut her out completely. She's not even She doesn't even have an open mind about it. She's just gone, that was a previous companion, therefore, and I'm convinced this is the subtext, therefore she is romantic competition for the Doctor.
Hmm. Uh-huh. So a bit to unpack there.
Please, bring me down to size, as I often ask you to do.
Um, First off, I don't know, maybe this is a small thing. Calling Rose a cow, not sure. That seems a bit harsh. Anyway, more to your point.
I stand by it.
Pardon?
I stand by it.
You stand by it, okay? More to your sort of broader point. It's like that does make sense, and there actually was a bit, or a couple of bits really, where, like they're not like that subtext that you mentioned. They're not terribly clear on it, and I guess that makes sense because it's subtext, right? But
Yeah.
like you do wonder, like it's just meant to be a romantic thing. And the weird thing is the way that, especially if you're a viewer of the classic series, there's enough ambiguity here where, like, how should I phrase this? You say that Rose sort of interprets this as sort of a odd romantic competition, but that's not the relationship that Sarah Jane had with the Doctor in the
No,
classic
of
series.
course
So
not. Yeah.
if you watch this, it's a bit confusing. Now, thankfully, the way it's written, there's enough ambiguity so that don't you don't have to automatically interpret um, the relationship between Sarah Jane and the Doctor as romantic. And I actually think that's even true, even if you haven't seen a lot of the classic series. Is just the way the writing works. It manages just to escape that, but it was
It does.
a little bit odd to see that.
Well, especially when you consider
Hmm,
that Rose's entire arc is about, and I mean
hmm,
it's front and center. Like at the end of this series, she'll say to the Doctor, "I love you," and he almost says it back.
hmm,
You know, that's their story. It's
hmm,
of the romance between them.
hmm,
So when we see her doing this, it's clear what she's thinking. You know.
hmm. And I wonder, it kind of goes back a little bit to something we said from the beginning about Doctor companion romances. We've
Mm-hmm.
got, um, it depends who the companion is. I suppose, like I think you said, if it's River, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But for the most part, not great. Just kind of icky and just a bit frustrating, really.
Yeah.
And like you wonder, like I'm sure I've personally mentioned this before, but like why couldn't it have been just like a strong friendship, I guess?
Exactly. Yeah. I
Because
mean,
when Sarah Jane says, some things are worth getting your heart broken for, like certainly if you watch the classic series, like a classic fan, like we know what that means.
mm,
We know that she's referring to this as like a really important friendship, but like they just keep muddying the waters here, and it's a little bit it is a little bit frustrating. I will admit.
well, it's also like the way that Mickey says the misses in the X, like that is bringing that parallel right to the forefront for the
Yeah,
audience.
and that actually reminds me. That's another thing, and I know again you're a bit more intense on this, certainly more intense than I am. But like when I watched that, especially because I watched it again this morning, and I'm like, right, okay, so we're obviously sort of establishing that this is the relationship that we're dealing with, and Mickey's saying this. So how does Mickey fit into the picture?
Well, exactly. I mean,
Is Yeah,
that's
like
his
is
whole arc in this episode, isn't it? Like Mickey's
yeah.
whole arc in this episode is about what's my role in this dynamic? Am I the
Yeah, and it's
Tim
like, oh,
Dodd?
I'm the robot dog. Jesus.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a. But yeah, like I'm sitting there, like, well, yeah. Have we actually ever? Has there ever been a discussion about this?
I mean,
Did,
also, like, have they ever admitted to kissing each other? Has Rose ever gone to Mickey and said, "I kissed the Doctor," or "The Doctor kissed me"?
mm,
And yes, it was to save my life, but I want to put those cards on the table because I want to be a good partner to you, even though I am all very, very clearly not a good partner to you. It's still happening. End of the episode. Mickey says, "Can I come on the TARDIS?" And Rose's face, she is appalled by this concept. She doesn't want Mickey there at all. Her own boyfriend, she's like, "Oh, but he's gonna get in the way of my flirting." Like, what the fuck?
um, So yeah, point is, yeah, it was a little bit confusing because I'm like, okay, that they're clearly acknowledging something's going on here, but they're not really exploring it or explaining it, and it would, in a way, like, here's the weird thing, right? That comment, like that line that Mickey has, in a way that would kind of make more sense if this was your first Doctor Who story, because you wouldn't have that strange context to fit it in. Granted, that would make it a little bit more frustrating because then that would, as you know, it would sort of confirm to the audience, okay, well, that is what this situation is.
Yeah. Well, I assume that Mickey is using it in reference to like just past companion and current companion. I don't think
Mm,
he is putting any romantic subtext on
mm,
that line.
mm,
But again, we know that Rose, that's what she's thinking about.
mm, mm.
And am I wrong
Certainly,
about her reaction to Mickey asking to come on the TARDIS? Like that's plain as day, right? She doesn't
I
want him there.
I don't remember it being that intense. I can't deny that it was because I vaguely remember her being
Well, he
sort
asks the
of.
Doctor if he can come on the TARDIS, and the Doctor says yes, and Rose is like, and she can't look at him, and Mickey's like, "Is that okay?" And she goes, "Yeah, fine, whatever." And whenever anyone uses that tone, you should it's
Mm,
clear that it's not fine
mm,
if they use that tone. You know, like that. If you're fine with something, you don't go, "Yeah, fine, whatever." You go,
mm,
"Yeah, fine, whatever."
mm. I'd have to probably watch the story a couple more times just to take a look at that, and certainly now that you've pointed it out, I'm gonna notice it. But look, I haven't seen it as much, I assume, as you have. You probably have noticed things that I haven't. I do want to say you're reaching a little bit. This doesn't. Just I
Hang
feel
on.
like if that was really clear, I feel like I would have noticed it more. I'm a bit torn there.
I wanna clarify this now. So I'm actually physically sending you a clip of it
Very well.
because I want you to
Mm,
see her reaction because to me this isn't something that is even up for debate. This is something that is incredibly clear, and I know this isn't going to be good content for an audio experience. But you know, like I said, I need this to be like okay. Here it is. So it's a 4 minute clip. I'm gonna send you the whole thing. I think
mm.
it's gonna happen about halfway through. You should be able to find the moment pretty
Yeah, yeah.
clearly. And like after Mickey, it the main reaction comes after the Doctor says yes, you can come on the TARDIS, but her face throughout the whole scene is like, why are you ruining this for me? Like, have a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go on, Doctor. Sarah Jane Smith and Mickey Smith. You need a Smith on board.
Okay, then I could do with a laugh. Rose, is that okay?
No, great. Why not?
You see what I mean?
Well, I better go.
Mm. Yes, I do see it now. Yeah, she has a bit of a look
Mm-hmm.
on her face.
Yeah, it's and even that tone of voice, like, no, great. Why
Yeah.
not? He's your boyfriend. You
Mm.
should want him there.
Mm.
And in fact, this time last season, you asked if he wanted to come. You have backslid. You have not become a better person. You've actively become a worse one.
Mm. And you wonder, like, the difference between this episode and that other episode is because Sarah Jane has been present and been, as far as Rose understands it, a competitor, so to speak.
Well, I think it's
Um,
also just the extra time that Rose has had with the Doctor
that's true. Yeah.
since the first time that she asked if Mickey could come on board.
Mm,
She's had a lot more time with the Doctor and
mm,
that relationship has clearly built up a lot more since then.
mm,
But she still hasn't let Mickey go. She's still
mm,
stringing him
mm,
along for no reason. And
mm,
you
mm,
know, like early in the episode, it's like I was right to call you, and Rose said, Are you sure that's the only reason you called?" Like she's still on the surface behaving as if there's a
mm,
connection there. There clearly isn't.
mm. Yeah, I can't having now just watched the scene, yeah, I can't deny that that's the case. I don't know. As I've said numerous times, I'm not inclined to sort of put all those pieces of the puzzle together so readily. But on the other hand, you could argue just because I'm not putting them together doesn't mean they're not there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, like, the interpretation is there. Like, you know, even
That
if
it's
it's not
possible to interpret it in that
exactly,
way.
yeah. And
Yeah.
at that point, maybe you take another pass at your character, because if that interpretation is there, then it's not
Mm.
unreasonable to suggest that it might become the main interpretation.
Yeah, so you'd say that this is one of those cases where ambiguity is not a particularly good thing.
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I,
If it even is ambiguous.
yeah, I mean, personally, I would have just written the character in the first place to not have a
Mm.
romantic involvement with the Doctor or treat her boyfriend like slime. But you know, if that's not how you interpret the character, then I don't think I can say that you're entirely wrong. Because I mean, I don't know
Mm.
what was going through Russell T Davies' head when he was writing
Mm.
the character or
Mm.
this arc. I mean, speaking of arcs, we like I hinted at, we have the start of Mickey's. Finally, we get the start of Mickey's redemption arc. We get the start of him finally gaining like the respect he deserves. Where we're going to see him like finally, well and truly cut the cord from Rose in the next few episodes. He's going to become more confident, more self-reliant. He's going to become all the things he should have already been. And it starts here. He has the realization with himself that it's entirely possible he's being treated like a dog.
Mm.
Um, and it's rough because it's something that I think a lot of okay, that wasn't even.
Sorry, I had to. Anyway.
I'm gonna rephrase that. It's tough because I think it's a realization he comes to like a season and a bit into his time on the show that I think a lot of audience members will have already deduced about him, which is tough. It's difficult if you know having that extended dramatic irony surrounding your role on a show and then only come to realize it when it's well and truly too late.
Yeah, yeah, his characterization is kind of interesting and pretty effective, I think, in this story. I want to bring up one small thing, which really I found very grating. It was a bit of a nails on the chalkboard line. And this sort of goes back to things that I've said before about Doctor Who, particularly with the classic, but even with the revival of things that haven't aged particularly well. The bit where the Doctor just says, "Oh yeah, you sounded like a little girl. I can see pigtails in a frilly dress," and I'm like, "Jesus Christ, Doctor, what the fuck is wrong with you?"
Yeah, it's
That's
another
such a
example
that's
of
such
just
a
like
sexist, shitty thing to say.
it is.
Like, what
I
the
interpreted
fuck?
it's not uncommon for the era, but it
No.
has kind of not aged that
No,
well.
no.
And it's another example of that kind of casual Mickey bullying that
Yeah, well, and the weird
hasn't
thing,
stopped yet.
well, the weird thing is, and I think I've raised this before. It hasn't happened, I don't think, to this extent. If the 10th Doctor has been bullying Mickey, it hasn't been certainly to this level of viciousness. But it
No,
seems a
certainly
bit
not.
at odds. Oh, pardon?
Certainly not. I think actually this
Yeah.
is their biggest interaction. Well, the only interactions they've had have been in Christmas Invasion. That was just like friendly Christmas stuff and saying hello because you're a new person now. I do think that overall the bullying that he gives Mickey as Tennant is a lot more playful than it is as Eccleston. Like you know,
It's still
it's not great still, but
no, it's still kind of shocking because I think when you think Tennant, you think the nice guy, the jovial, fun, um, caring person. I mean, don't get me wrong, Eccleston obviously had his sense of compassion, but you always sensed with him, he was more troubled, I suppose you could say. So it makes more sense for him to be a bit of a bully to the people around him. I mean, that element you could argue is maybe true. Like the bullying element, you could argue is kind of true across most Doctors, but it's more present in some than others. And I just generally find that it's not with Tennant. So it's very strange and very disconcerting to see him saying this really awful shit. So
Well, in the next episode, he compares Mickey to a horse. So I mean, it's still present in the character. It's just that because Mickey isn't around for a lot of Tennant, I don't think it's as
yeah, it's not as prominent because you
Yeah.
just don't notice it as much. Yeah. So anyway, that's just something I wanted to bring up because I'm like, man, I don't remember that line.
no. That stuck out to me as well. It was a bit
Yeah,
out of
it's
place.
Anyway, but as you say, the characterization of him works pretty well.
Yeah,
Even at the beginning, like it's clear, like even from the beginning, he's the one who sort of set them up on this mission. Um, using the
Like,
password to crack into the government.
he's using the skills that were established in World War Three.
Yeah, which is great to see.
Yeah, nice internal consistency. But it's also nice to see that Torchwood is still a big deal. He's the one. He's the one. He can hack Unit, but he can't hack Torchwood. That's nice. Like, it's like in the background, subtextually setting up how important and how like high profile Torchwood is.
Yeah, it works quite well in that sense.
It's a good K9 episode. Finally, we've yet to see have a good one on this podcast.
Yeah, because
But it's a good one for K9. I mean, he's had lovely character growth from the classic series. This time, like, the revived series is treating him well. In the revived series, when he blows himself up, it's for a purpose.
Oh yes, rather than driving into the water. Yeah, to get rid of him. Yeah, that's definitely true.
But he's really charming in this. He's really, really endearing
Yes.
to a new viewer. To the point where I legitimately forgot how little of this episode he's actually in.
Yeah, he's not in a lot, but they make the most of it when he is there, certainly. Which is really good.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but yeah, as you say, he's just a really endearing, fun, cute little character, doing his thing. He's affirmative master. It's all just it's all good fun.
Yeah, well, I think my favorite interaction is good dog, affirmative, and then 2 minutes later, bad dog, affirmative.
Affirmative. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good writing, in that
definitely.
sense.
How do we feel about the Scasis paradigm?
Yeah, it's like
It's the kind of sci-fi concept that sort of it lands differently with different people depending on your sensibilities. Like the idea of there being a formula to control like the building blocks of the universe essentially, and if you cracked it, you would have the capacity to alter them and change reality, time, and space on a whim. It's something that, for how big it is, isn't really a huge focus. Like I
No,
would have
it's-
expected something like this to be like when you think of an equation that can control reality, you expect that to be okay. That's what the master's gunning for.
yeah, or
Well,
it's
that's
or
what Davros is trying to.
or at
trying to
least it's a
crack.
full that would be a story. Like
Yeah, that would be
you
a
could-
series arc. That would be like, okay, maybe like the Doctor noticing that things aren't quite right in the universe, but can't put a finger on it, and then he discovers that the Scasis paradigm has been cracked, and you get a cliffhanger right before the season finale that the big bad of the season uses the Scasis paradigm to alter the Doctor's physiology, maybe turn the Doctor evil. That would be a nice little button on that one. But I think it's kind of wasted on this one episode. Which isn't even that isn't even the main focus, with a bunch of villains that we don't really get a sense of what they would do with it either.
I'm glad you brought up the whole sort of multiple interpretations of it, because I have a couple of mixed feelings about that whole exchange. So, sorry.
Which exchange?
Oh, the conversation about the God particle when they're when
When Anthony Head is confronting them in the
Yeah.
classroom after they've realized what the
Yes,
plan is. Okay,
yes.
so that's when the Doctor is tempted by it, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And there are a couple of different feelings I have about that, because on one hand, yes, I agree. I don't like the idea of any being, having access to that kind of power. I've said before, the Doctor, walks around, acting enough like a god as it is. Neither the Doctor nor anyone else needs, I think, that kind of power, and I find it unsettling. Um, Frankly, the idea that someone could have so much power, so that the fact that he, doesn't get tempted in the end, despite how pretty understandable his temptation is, that's a good thing.
Well,
There
especially
is,
because his initial he's tempted by the altruism through which he could
yes, and
go
actually that
forward with
is
it.
a really good bit of writing that sort of Anthony Head's character is more appealing to his more, I suppose, humanitarian side rather than,
Yes.
he's not doing a Davros. He's saying, join me and you'll have total power. It's, we want your wisdom and your experience to help build a better world. I mean, that could very well be a lie for all we know, but still, the fact that they're addressing the issue in that way is quite unique and it's quite good. There is something that Sarah Jane says, and I'm gonna bring up the quote because I wrote it down. 1 minute. Yeah. So when she's giving her rationalization for why the Doctor shouldn't have that kind of power, again, the I don't know, the very very basics of the argument that the Doctor shouldn't have that kind of power, I agree with. But then she says this. She says pain and loss, they define us as much as happiness or love. This is probably just a completely personal thing. I'm more than happy to take that. I don't like that line of logic a lot. Again, I'm probably just projecting a little bit here, just with my own personal experiences. I don't like the idea of suffering just being this innate quality in life that we just kind of have to accept. I find that idea very uncomfortable and really frustrating. I mean, how shall I put this? I mean, I won't go into too much detail because personal stuff, but you've known me for a long time. Some of the things that I've been through, for example, I would get very frustrated if someone were to turn around and tell me, "Oh yeah, no, that's just how it is. That was meant to happen, Nick. It's made you stronger or more resilient." Well, I'm kind of sick of being resilient. So, point is that sort of logic bothers me. I mean, I'm at the point now where I think Anthony Burgess said like that evil has to exist along with the good, and I'm not sure if I buy that argument anymore. I mean, I don't know, like good and evil. That may be a bit of an extreme way of putting it, but like suffering in general, I don't like the idea that that's just a part of life. I'm of the opinion, and I am admittedly taking the argument a bit far here, but if everyone thought like that, people, society wouldn't progress, diseases wouldn't be cured. Um, uh, you know, I suspect, equality wouldn't be granted to all people. We're living in a pandemic at the moment,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and if people thought that way, if people just thought, yeah, uh, people dying, yeah, that's totally normal, totally cool, normal, nothing we can do about that. Um, you know, don't bother getting everybody vaccinated in time. Yeah, no, that's totally not important. Just accept it. I don't buy that line of
Um,
argument at all. Um,
yeah.
hmm,
Look, I see what you're saying. I do
mm-hmm,
think you're sort of uh, misinterpreting
mm-hmm.
the line a
Sure,
fair
sure.
bit. Well, it's also not only is it on the heels of the Doctor talking about how he could go back and save people who've already died.
Mm,
I don't think Sarah Jane is using pain and loss to refer to all suffering. I
mm-hmm,
think she's more using it to refer to the grieving process and
mm-hmm,
death in general.
mm-hmm,
But also, Sarah Jane is someone who is also an altruistic figure. She does a lot of things for the betterment of
mm,
other people.
mm-hmm,
So when she says that, I doubt that she's saying, you know, suffering is good and everyone should suffer in order to know
mm,
what true happiness is. I
mm,
don't think she's saying
mm-hmm,
that. Um,
mm.
yeah,
Yeah, fair enough.
I
Because
do
that
think
is
there
how
is.
I interpreted it, admittedly,
Yeah,
but fair
and I
enough.
think that is a bit of a fallacy that you're
Sure.
approaching that line under.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Um, because again, in context, it's clearly about rewriting deaths which have already happened.
Yeah, and the whole the rewriting of history, which not even Time Lords are really meant to do.
Yeah,
Really meant
exactly.
to do.
And I think the subtext of what she's saying is more death is what gives life meaning, not pain and loss define us, so let's not try and save anyone who's in pain.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I don't think that's where she's coming from with that.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think, like, I wrote that down because it did. It was more, I think, the initial sort of shock at that moment. Again, like I said, I'll happily admit I'm probably projecting a little bit there. But it didn't. Like, I'm surprised how little that line bothered me overall, but that, again, is because it's in context. It's in context of knowing who these characters are, what the story is about, and the conversation that's literally just taken place. So, yeah, that's fair.
Sure. I mean, it's a valid interpretation to bring up. If I'm allowed to voice my opinion on the Rose of it all, you're allowed to give your interpretation of
sure.
the Skase's paradigm.
But as you say, like, in a way, I mean, you could argue in a way that, should it be as ambiguous about that as it is? But the fact that it is fine. Like, this is an example of ambiguity. Like, it works enough to its benefit.
And if you want to talk about different interpretations, how do you feel about this episode framing a high school as a place that consumes the souls of children and uses all their imagination up until they're all the same?
So, high school.
Yeah, basically, because I saw that written down in a review, and I just I don't know how intentional that was, but I suppose it might be. Like, he literally says it uses imagination, and it uses their imagination, and they're not just using the kids, they're using their souls. It might be an allegory for that.
We don't need no education. I jokingly said when you did the sync up, I quoted, School's Art by Alice Cooper, but school literally gets blown to pieces in the end. Gee, I wonder what they're trying to say there.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably, I remember, like I said, I read that in a review somewhere, and I probably would agree with it if that was, what the episode was about. Like, if we saw that the kids were becoming, more and more identical, or maybe they were,
it was about conformity, yeah.
Yeah, about conformity. Like, if their imagination was, if their, individuality was being stripped from them, if they were all sort of, if their behavior patterns were shifting along with their intelligence being boosted and their willingness to forego their yard time to go back into class. I think if that was more of a focus, I might agree, but it might also just be another small thing that the episode comments on.
I think it probably is. It's not major, but it's there, I think.
It definitely is there. That oil wore off so quickly.
To be fair, the episode... Jesus Christ. The episode opens with a kid getting slaughtered, so...
It does! I can't believe how quickly I forgot about that. Mr. Finch is like, oh, you don't have any parents. Cool, you're fair game to eat.
Man.
No, there would still be investigations. People would still know she's gone missing. People would still know there's something wrong.
Maybe the logic is like, oh yeah, no, we're alien invaders, and yeah, maybe the authorities will come after us, but they won't have enough time. We'll have cracked the Skase's paradigm then, and we'll have left, and then the authorities can just pick up the pieces.
I mean, it was also kind of distracting in that scene, like, when you hear the scream of the child. That is not a child screaming. That is a fully grown woman doing the scream for this 8-year-old, basically.
Yeah, I think I did notice that. Like obviously not heaps, and certainly you've obviously had to point it out for me, but now that I think about it...
It's honestly pretty fair, because I think having that scene followed by a literal child screaming, that's traumatizing.
Yeah, it's... Yeah, it's pretty fucked. But yeah, I mean... Man, it's an intense opening. I'll give him that.
Yeah, I mean, it leads us into talking about the Krillitanes nicely. Like, it's
yes.
The composite species. Like, they don't just adapt customs from the places that they conquer. They adapt physical attributes as well. A fascinating concept. It opens up to the Krillitanes returning in the future with a completely different design, which I think could be fun. And that way, you could do a story with them that incorporates their actual physiology and their species a lot better than this episode does, because let's face it, we mentioned it already, the Skase's paradigm, that could have been any villain.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
I would love to
Um,
see another Krillitane story that like really takes advantage of their unique, uh, biological ability.
mm,
I don't know what story you could tell with it. I mean, honestly, that would have been a better fit for if it was a commentary on the school system stripping individuality. You know,
yeah.
you have the Krillitanes who adapt the species that they
Mm,
encounter. Maybe they all start a bit different, and then, by the end they're all just like an amorphous blob because that's like
mm,
what happens when you try and take away what makes something unique. You all just become one thing. I don't
mm,
know. I haven't thought about it long enough to be able to give it a compelling enough pitch for it yet. But I think there's something there.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. Um, it's yeah, it is interesting. Having
Also,
them
just really quickly, I like the image of
sure
like when the doctor says, "I didn't recognize them because last time they looked like us, but just with
with
really
really
long
long
necks."
necks.
I just love the image of that, primarily because for some reason I'm imagining it in a way where the neck hasn't adapted for it. Like it hasn't got enough muscles to support it. So like the head is sort of like flopping around and like it's
Or
like
maybe coiled like a python on the neck or something.
well, it's either
On
called
the
like
on
a
the shoulders,
python
excuse me.
or it's either called like a python or like whenever they take a step or move, the neck sort of moves with the center of gravity as well, so it's just sort of flopping about a whole bunch. I didn't imagine it like a giraffe's neck at all. I imagined it um, like a something that has all the elasticity taken out of it, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I did imagine it as sort of like giraffe neck, but yes, that's also a pretty fair interpretation. And certainly, like if they're deliberately taking these qualities, yeah, maybe there could have been I don't know, like an accident or something where they didn't assimilate that physical quality onto their forms properly, so it
I know
might have been
it
quite comical.
almost certainly is the giraffe approach, but
Hmm.
I just found it funny to picture
Yeah, yeah,
a whole
fair.
bunch of people walking around with their
Hmm.
ridiculous necks flopping about all over the place. I just
Hmm.
thought that was a nice image.
Hmm. Um, yeah, like having them come back, it might be fun. Because I think there's more to explore there. They've certainly got. I mean, it's mainly because of Anthony Head and his performance, but they've got a certain kind of, you know, wonderful villainous guile about them that would uh, make them interesting villains if they came back again.
Well, it would also be
So
nice, especially nowadays, to have it be a scathing commentary on the British Empire,
it would actually.
because
No, it
there
really
is a
would.
there is a change nowadays. People who like the whole debate about the artifacts in British museums, the
Mm,
original people who those artifacts belong to want them back,
mm,
and
mm,
the assholes in England who go no, we're still looking at them.
mm.
It would
Yeah,
be it's I think it's a commentary that not a lot of people, or at least not a lot of intelligent people, would oppose to.
yeah. I
Um,
think
yeah, it might be
yeah, it would
something to
work.
look. It might be something to consider if and when we do our second season of us writing the show.
Too, who's produced? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When we do that, whenever we do that again, if we decide to
Yeah.
or not, I'll
Um,
pencil in a Krillitane episode because I think
yeah.
that could be fun.
I think yeah, I think so. And they, I mean, there's only really one line where the Doctor says, just as you know, I forgot exactly what he said, but just as you know, the cultures you've either conquered or have no, that you've invaded, all the ones that have invaded you, you know, you've taken bits and pieces, but mapping that onto actual stealing of like artifacts, for example,
Yeah,
um, or some physical property in humanity or any species for that matter, would work well as a sort of anti-imperialist commentary,
yeah,
which is quite interesting. Yeah.
yeah. I think that could be really fun, and it's a
Mm.
shame that this episode doesn't really, utilize that aspect of the characters as much as it potentially could, because like that is
Yeah.
my main criticism of this episode overall. It's a whole bunch of different elements that don't gel all that well with each other.
Mm.
The Krillitanes, who could be an anti-imperialist thing, the school setting, which could end up being
Mm.
a scathing commentary on the
Mm.
education system, the Scasis paradigm, which is a character test and an examination of personal morals. All of those elements, I think, belong in stories that really give that element the focus. And this episode doesn't really do that for any element.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing because I think the story for what it is and how it's combining all these ideas, it works well enough. Like, there's nothing like I can't point to any massive plot problem. Like, oh yeah, why did they make this decision?
Yeah, I mean,
But
it's certainly not. It's not a bad story for having those elements in them. It's just that those elements could be better utilized or
yeah,
explored in other ways.
it's a bit of wasted potential because there's
Yeah.
like 4 or 5 different really great Doctor Who ideas here that they're not really exploring thoroughly enough, and they can't. They don't have the time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I compare this to. It's not exactly a fair comparison because this is a 1 episode story, and the comparison I'm about to give is a 2 episode story. But Silence in the Library, for example, that has about 10 different unique sci-fi concepts in it. The whole planet is a library. The shadows move and eat people. A digital world housed by dead people. This young girl who sees the library in her TV. All of those could potentially have enough meat in them to support themselves, but they all really work well together in that story. They really combine in a really, really satisfying way. This one, they all combine in a way that, I mean, it works, but I would have liked to have seen really any of these elements given more of a focus.
Yeah, you almost wonder, especially given it's a classic companion returning, and you want to maybe even devote a bit more time to that. Could they have made this a 2-part story?
I mean,
Because
maybe. My issue with that one might end up seeming a bit more unfocused, because I think if you give any one element of what we've just of the thematic nature of any of the plot elements, if you give any one of them more focus, I think it becomes a lot more telling that it should be an isolated thing. And I think if you stretch this out to 2 episodes, the episode would seem kind of unbalanced, because you do have all these really different concepts meshing together, and if you expand all of them, I think this episode only works with the plot and character elements that it has because they're all like sort of subtext or like there but not quite fully, because I imagine all of these different concepts as sort of like in a box, and the box is like the perfect size for these elements, but if you make any of the elements bigger, they start to get a bit they jam up against each other. The box starts to bulge a bit. It's almost the perfect length episode for the elements that you have, and if you try and make the episode longer, you have to give the themes more meaning, and you have to pick and choose which ones to give the focus to, and then at that point you might as well just take one of the concepts and expand it.
Yeah,
because otherwise you lose stuff from the other elements. I mean, either way, I think the solution is to just pick one and roll with it, and then you have.
Yeah.
I mean, you may have lost this episode, but good news, you have 2 or 3 other ones you can also write.
And I think, as I said, the big draw here is Sarah Jane coming back and all those characterizations that happen there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because what would this story be without that, right?
Well, definitely. Like the focus of the episode is the characterization, and that to that element, to that point rather, the whole what does the Doctor leave behind in terms of the companions? What does life look like after a companion leaves the TARDIS? That element's the most important one. And that's the one that's given the most focus. So I think in a weird way that sort of belongs in a more standard plot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, but because if they took out, like, if Sarah Jane didn't come back, for example, like, what would this story really be? Because you could theoretically still do it, but man, it would just be so. I want to say it would be bang on average, but you'd probably run the risk of making it a bit mediocre, honestly.
I think if you take Sarah Jane out and you don't, if you try and adjust as little as possible, but after that, I think the thing you would have to focus on is the education aspect of it. That
Yeah.
would have to be the focus, because otherwise, if you give the Krillitanes the focus, you go, well, why are they in a school? Whereas if you give the school the focus,
Yeah.
I think the Krillitane, the fact that they take stuff from species they conquer and sort of remove the uniqueness of that species in a weird way, I think that works just enough to justify it being in an
Yeah.
episode about the education system and how it removes individuality and
Yeah.
discourages uniqueness.
Mm.
That I think that works just enough. I don't know how well the Scasis paradigm fits into that after the fact. But, I mean, there's probably a couple tweaks you can make to that to make that work. I think if you were to take Sarah Jane out of the story, that would have to be the route you take, because otherwise I don't think it holds up under its own
No.
merits otherwise.
No. No, I agree. Yeah, it wouldn't. Like, you know, Sarah Jane coming back, that is the main thing. And there's a reason for that. Like, it doesn't. At the very least, as you say, if they were to take her out of it, you would have to make quite a couple of changes and reshift the focus thematically to really make it work.
Yeah, I think we're getting towards the end of this discussion, but before we do, I want to
Sure.
highlight another element of this episode, and indeed, pretty much every Revived Era episode we've talked about so far that we haven't talked about nearly enough, and that's Murray Gold. The composer for all of Doctor Who since 2005, right up until the end of Peter Capaldi. He is the main composer. I love his music so much.
I was going to say,
So much. Like, I meant to mention it in Tooth and Claw.
same. I was gonna say it. The werewolf theme. Holy shit!
Werewolf
How
theme
great is that?
amazing. I love that. That theme is honestly part of why that episode works so well and why the horror works so well, because it is
Yeah.
so like foreboding, and like the big choir's going and the werewolf is running, and that theme incidentally is going to come back at the end of the Satan Pit. That's the theme of the beast that they use when the planet's falling into the black hole. They reuse that track, but also the Scasis paradigm music in this episode. It's kind of a similar vibe where it's got like the big instruments and the choirs doing their thing as well, and it does a lot to heighten the image of students typing at a computer.
Yeah. I think some of the really rapid editing they used in those scenes helps with it too. But
It does.
yes,
well,
the music.
But it's a travesty that we haven't mentioned Murray Gold at all yet.
Yeah.
I'm going to be talking about him a lot more in the Cyberman 2-parter that's got coming up, because that's when his iconic Cyberman riff comes in for the first time. Those 6 notes in succession that will, I think, feature in every single Cyberman story after that, up until a certain point when he leaves the show. I love his soundtrack so much. He has so many great themes. The Gallifrey theme that he writes is incredible. The music that plays when the Daleks appear in Stolen Earth is incredibly foreboding. It's the best Dalek theme ever composed. I could point out so many of his tracks that are almost as iconic as the episodes they're in my opinion.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And it is interesting that they, you know, brought him on and commissioned him to make these very symphonic orchestral arrangements, because that is in a fair bit of contrast to the classic series.
It is, yeah.
Whose music varies from. Okay, this is a whole other separate topic, but if you look at Doctor Who and the classic series and look at the soundtracks and how they've evolved, it's a really interesting evolution, because they go from quite a minimalist and often really strange and experimental use of synthesizers. I mean, you only have to look at any number of particularly second and third Doctor stories, unbelievably bizarre musical elements, which I think really suits the stylized tone of the show. It's one of the reasons why I think it's Doctor Who should certainly be brought up in discussions of the evolution of synthesizer music, along with God, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. I'll look her up in a minute. But the woman who did the synthesizer music for Clockwork Orange and some of other Kubrick's films. Anyway, So that I think should be brought up in these sorts of discussions. But watching it evolve, it becomes more conventional as the stories go along. The series overall goes along. The arrangements become less what's the word, sporadic, I guess, and less disparate. And by the time you get to not Christopher Eccleston, excuse me, Sylvester McCoy's era, it's full on symphonic. It's still done with synthesizers, and I know that because I've seen some behind the scenes thing with the composer for the Curse of Fenric, and he showed the equipment he used, how to do it. But it's very symphonic. Symphonic. They're using synthetic string sections and really nice sort of bass drum coming in. So watching it progress like that, into the revival era, which even though it obviously is closer to Sylvester McCoy's era than it is to almost anything that came before it.
Yeah.
Still watching them go to this era of full blown symphony to the point where I think, as you mentioned, at the end of Tennant's last episode, they have a chorus saying, "What is a goodbye 10 in Latin or something like
Yeah,
that."
yeah, exactly, yeah.
So watching them do that change is interesting because it is a bit of a risk, I guess, because it is breaking with the style of the old classic Who. They're obviously trying to define themselves here. But the great part is it, in its own way, it's still as melodramatic as a lot of the music from the classic era. It's just done, again, as I've said with many other stylistic elements of the revival era, it's taking the melodrama and the wackiness of the classic series, but making it a bit more mainstream, a bit more cinematic, and it's doing that really well. And I think certainly Murray Gold deserves a lot of props for making, I suppose, that transition as smooth as it is, while also making it really exciting and coming up with these, as you say, really beautiful, unbelievably memorable tunes. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like indicative of the time as well. Like as Doctor Who as a show, it like obviously as most shows do, but not to this extent because not all shows have this longevity. Evolving with the TV standards of its time. And I think, well, that's almost evident from like the switch from serialized, multi-part, 20 minutes, 4 episodes each, to these really standalone 45-minute spectacles. I think they needed to make the soundtrack fit a modern audience. And this does Murray Gold is just an incredible composer in that regard. I miss him a lot in the Chibnall era. I can't remember a single piece of music from the Chibnall era.
yeah,
I'll
neither.
put it that way. Whereas so many of Murray Gold's compositions live rent free in my head. It was a bit overplayed in the 11th Doctor era, but I Am the Doctor is like a really good theme for that Doctor. Obviously, there's a lot of. It's also interesting watching his style change with a new Doctor as well, because like you might not even realize in this shift from Tennant to Smith the composer is the same person, but it is, and I think he's
that always surprised me.
yeah, well, he's really good at, I think, not only like tracking what a showrunner, the tone that they're going for in their era, and switching the music accordingly, because like with the RTD era, it's a lot of huge big tracks. They're like triumphant. There's a lot of choirs and stuff, and then when Smith comes in, it becomes a lot more like mysterious, and sort of there's less choir and there's a lot more strings. Like the violin becomes a lot more of a focus. And then when Capaldi comes in, the instrumentals switch up again. He's really good at making his own music seem really different than itself.
Yeah, and I think in a way that's tough because even like if you think of the great Hollywood composers, Howard Shore, John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Bernard Herrmann, even for the most part, even though they obviously are good at coming up with, individually really catchy songs, and themes and things like that. Like, each of their styles. Like, I can, um, generally speaking, I can tell, I think, if it's a Howard Shore score or a John Williams score. So the fact that Murray Gold is able to, as you say, evolve and to keep his style still consistent, certainly, at that consistent quality, but to change with the direction of the showrunner, for example, it works really well, and he certainly deserves to be applauded for that.
Yeah. Let's rank School Reunion. I think we've pretty much covered it by this point.
Um, I'm gonna go with what my gut instinct told me. I'm gonna go with a 7 for this one.
Yeah, I think I am too. I think in our discussions, I think it loses that point. I was initially going to go with an 8, but I think it loses that point for me more so for the missed potential of what it could have been, as well as the whole Rose stuff, which I think we covered pretty early on that I despise. But yeah, I think it's solid. It's really good at its characterization and some of its themes, but the plot doesn't really hold up in comparison, and not in a way that it takes a back seat for the more important stuff to be the forefront. It doesn't do a really simplistic plot in order to heighten the character stuff. It tries to do a lot of really interesting plot stuff that doesn't really fit.
Sure.
And that annoys me a bit. So yeah, I think 7's pretty accurate.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, so next time we are going to be looking at Revelation of the Daleks, the second last in our classic era Davros marathon. Spoilers, I don't know how I feel about that episode.
That's interesting. Because I'm pretty sure I know how I feel about it. Yeah, it'll be fascinating to discuss that.
Yeah, I mean, I right before we started recording this, I finished watching it, and I don't know, it's a weird one, but I mean, in terms of Davros, he's still great, and he's still the best part of it, but everything else is a bit of a mixed bag for me. But anyway, that's for next time. Until then, I've been Alex.
I've been Fitz, and remember, school's been blown to pieces.
I was going to say class dismissed, but good on you for stealing my thunder.
That's what I'm here for.